Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your monthly podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Soka University of America here in Orange County, California. My own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today we have Moni Siv, the founder and CEO of Teach for Cambodia. We go through his educational background and inspirations and what it's like to start a new organization, along with some of the challenges and barriers he had to face. Let's get to the show.
All right. Welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you on. I was looking forward to this for a while. And, my first question, I see this a lot in education where somebody starts out maybe in the STEM fields and then they move to become an educator. And it seems like you did that a little bit as well. You started with a BA in biology at Washington University in St. Louis. And then you switched over to an MA in urban education at UPenn. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how you got interested in education and maybe like why did you make the change or the jump there?
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. It's a big question, right?
I know. True.
It took me back to Cambodia and where I grew up. I think it's sort of like the answer start there.
Sure.
I was just thinking as a 6 years old, and I told my mom, I think we are poor. I think we are really poor. And she just asked me like, why you feel that way? I told her that for a month now, we have no meat to eat. And so that's sort of, as a child growing up, realizing that I'm poor. And it's been a big awareness about poverty. As my parents divorced, my mom was adopted and she didn't have the opportunity to go to school. So that say a lot. And I just growing up realizing that how much poverty made me feel invisible, not seen, not valued. And my mom just invests everything that she has on my education, right? And so I realized that all I want in life growing up is stability, security, and feelings that I'm secure, right? My future is secure. And that's got me into like a lot of life and going to the States, and all I want is, achievement and getting into STEM and areas and those kind of major will give me that stability and safety, but not necessarily what is best for me in terms of, who I am, what my values are, and what I want to do in life. And STEM field also just like something that I was thinking like my creativity can also help the world change fundamentally about everything. It's like STEM gonna solve every problems in the world. And I think the major shift for me is really like, I was recruited to be a teacher in Camden, New Jersey, for 2 years with Teach for America. And I sort of like, you know what? I'm going to get out of my comfort zone for the first time. And that this comfort really teach me about humility, about purpose, about, what I really like, who am I and what I want to do in my life, which is education. And thinking about how much education can do to a child that growing up in poverty, that say you are visible, you are seen, and education probably the only hope. I feel like that is who I am. I guess that's how I shift.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. I think it's one of those things like maybe early on sort of chasing what you might have thought was a career that you could, that are like quote unquote financial rewards or what's seen as financial rewards. And then as you get older, started thinking like, well, these other things that I can follow my passion and still have, a great career. So I think that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And it gets into my next question actually. And it's maybe just as big because, you said like, oh, life decisions. Well, the second question is also a life decision. Often I find my interviewees on the podcast, they've studied abroad, maybe they studied in another country, and it always comes back to this decision. Should I stay in that host country or should I return back home and bring back my skills and knowledge and things like that? It sounds like you had sort of a period between maybe school where you were teaching. And so I'm curious, that sort of process of you were teaching and then maybe decided to come back to Cambodia. So can you maybe talk about that time in your life and then that choice to eventually come back to Cambodia? Again, another big question. Sorry.
I think we all face big question. I think I start with, I think the most difficult question that I face, it's not about coming to Cambodia, but why me, right? Why me who has to return home? Why me who has to sort of start a local work here? It's like, why me? It took a bit away, so searching for 2 years. And still thinking, it's a constant question, right? But why me doing this work of leadership? And as I start early on, it's I didn't choose this. I feel like the challenge chose me for some reason, right? Growing in poverty, I'm so satisfied with my education's journey so far in Cambodia, but also in the United States. And I am just realizing how much a lot of people, in the system, but everyone just investing in my own journey. And I feel enormous gratitude about what I have and what I receive and what I tuning in and the power that I have, right? And so I just like, okay, so what am I doing with all the gratitude that I have? And I make a choice that I need to come back home and I need to be a new sort of example of counter narrate the existing narrative about about that. And that's also part of the things about me in terms of like, it's really come from that gratitude. But then on the second part is, I was just so inspired by the idea about vulnerability. Sort of how much vulnerable, like how can you be vulnerable enough for you to sort of take all the courage to pursue the highest purpose that you receive and listen from everyone's about what you do. And I feel like that's the hardest fight ever, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty coming back home. There's a lot of fear. I'm not good enough, self-doubt. But despite all that, I feel like that whole idea is that like I have to be vulnerable to really come back home and create an impact is really the other values that feels like shaping that choice.
Right. That's a powerful idea of thinking like, am I good enough? Is this, can I actually do that? Certainly. Let's maybe jump into it then. You're the founder, CEO of Teach for Cambodia. So I'd, love to hear more about, the organization, even maybe the connection to your experience in the United States and sort of taking and maybe translating things over or how you sort of worked within that since you had experience before. And I'm just quite interested in just like how you started this organization and built it up and just those barriers that you might have faced. I mean, I think people would be fascinated with some, hearing the story of how you got it off the ground.
Oh gosh. So I was a teacher and I never raised one before. I never set up an organization, never lead a team, to be honest. But I'm very convicted to these ideas that true change come from collective leadership. It's come from locally led movement, right? It's the people, right? And so when I return back home, so I always like, even if I stay in the United States for about 10 years, but I always come back home every year. And I'm just fascinated by the history and the people here, right? But I think for me, the ways that I'm looking at the problems that I'm currently solving is just enormous, that I alone cannot do it. But if a collective leadership movement that can come together as a solution, I feel like we can move the needle for kids. For that, like for me, what sort of I realized that the root cause of the problem in the United States and in the world about education it's the same. It just look different in its nature. And so if I'm just go back to the calculation about, wait a minute, it's like what create an education outcome, the empowerment of kids. I was just thinking about 3 factors. Like one is teaching quality, because teaching quality shape learning quality, right? Number two is looking at accessibility, whether kids have access to education in the first place. And number three is really environment around kids. And so when I come back home, my statistical brain just want to like, okay, what does the problem look like in number, right? At least at that level of intellectual. I then realizing that, oh my goodness, teaching qualities in Cambodia, looking at like about 70%. This is a bit more pre-pandemic numbers, right? Like about 70% of our teacher has no bachelor degree, the one that's so in basic education system. And that's like, okay, and then who joined the teaching profession and all that. And then when looking at learning quality, it doesn't surprise me. So the Cambodian government has Ministry of Education Usage Board has sort of measured student learning through PISA-D. And in 2018, it shows that 80% of Cambodian children has only 8%. 8% of us, like of our kids, meet the minimum proficiency in literacy, and then particularly reading, and then 10% in math, minimum proficiency. I was like, okay, that makes sense. Because you're looking at the teaching qualities and the learning qualities seem to be translated in that sense, right? And then I'm looking at like, okay, so how many kids actually have access to school in the first place? And you're looking at primary school, only 82% of kids finish primary school. Then looking at enrollment rate in seventh grade, it was like around 56%. And then numbers start to drop when you go into 10th grade, that only about 30% go into 10th grade. And then university enrollment is like 14%, which is like lowest in Southeast Asia. It's like, oh gosh, like, so you drop out of schools, it means you drop out of life in the first place, right? And so accessibility has been like, oh, that's an enormous issue, right? And if I'm a parent, I'm poor, I put my kids into a system that doesn't really yield outcomes, I might not make the investment in the first place. And because I'm poor, then I would need my kids to actually help me earn incomes, right? And so that sort of how the challenges around the communities and the weak system also like becoming an issues. And then start looking at the environment and to realize that our government spending is about 3.3% of GDP on education a while ago, and I noticing that like the recommendation is around 4 to 6%, and that translated into like school lacking infrastructure, even basic sanitation and things that is missing, and crowded classrooms, like one teacher can teach up to like 70 or 60 kids, 2 shift morning and afternoon, crowded nature. And I'm just starting to think about, okay, so if I'm a teacher and I'm not very well equipped to teach, and I go into the system with that sort of accessibility issue, environment issues, no qualifications, and not continuous services, I'm gonna burn out as a teacher, you know. But this is the price we pay with the legacy of colonization, but also like genocide that killed 80% of our teacher, you know, in the recent history and all of that. And that is the challenges that Teach for Cambodia face on a daily basis when we place our high energy, committed young leaders come from all backgrounds and career interests into the schools, and we're like, oh my God, like this is the opportunity to make an impact. It's so high, but at the same time, like, okay, how are we gonna do this, right? And so that's the core sort of challenges we face. But the ways I'm looking at this is that, like, who gonna do this? Who gonna solve this? Are we waiting for like international folks to coming in and like improve everything, or are we saying that, you know what, there need to be a locally led movement of young leaders in Cambodia, a new source of leadership that can like collaborate, partner with our government and every stakeholder here to really push this forward. So that's sort of at the core of our model is we are saying this. The work of building a nation start in the classroom. And teachers is the core of that rebuilding work, right? And the fundamental unit of change in the system is really families. And so how are we gonna do this, you know? Having a humble resilience, but in a way they're creative, like local movement. So TFC, one of our holistic strategic partner is the Royal University of Phnom Penh, particularly Faculty of Education, and also the Ministry of Education more broadly in the private sector, right? And for example, why do TFC work with the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia? Why not any other folks, right? A bit of a background. This is how my grandmother taught me about the Royal University of Phnom Penh. It's the university that is assigned or created by our former king to help rebuild a nation back, to rebuild teaching profession and the scholars for the nation, to sort of rebuild a nation during the colonization, like, and after that, and like about rebuilding that. And so we picked that partners to sort of symbolizing the same sort of aspiration. Like we want to work with the Royal University of Phnom Penh to sort of, okay, how are we gonna do this, right? So we recruit folks, students from that university, and other university in Cambodia. We developed them for 2 years in our leadership development program called Teach for Cambodia Fellowship. And then we place them in public school where the problems start, in the classroom where the work of building a nation is started, right? And we want to sort of like the future leaders of Cambodia to sort of expose to the challenges, the aspirations, how reforms work and how it doesn't work, and everything's in that community, so that our aspiration is that when they become leaders of change in the country, they understand, they informed by that, local contact. And 5 years in, so Teach Cambodia is a local NGO that established in 2017, and now we are like, this year is like 5-year anniversary for us, right? And so far we have 96 active teachers and alumni. 60 are alumni, and 85% of our alumni still commit in education. 10% still pursue advanced degree in education. 100% of our alumni has a Master of Education from RUPP, the Royal University of Phnom Penh. So 33% supporting the sort of nationwide reforms in terms of retraining teachers, upgrading school leaders to sort of tackling teacher quality nationwide, working with school directly to increase accessibility and more resourcing into school in terms of the environment. 33% still continue teaching in those schools, and we feel like we sort of contribute this significant new source of leadership through partnering with the government, the Royal University of Phnom Penh, to sort of like, okay, we need to build our core capacity back if we want to move this forward, right? Okay, we'll pause here.
Sure. Yeah, no, that was in depth. So I do appreciate that. You've talked a little bit already about working with the government, specifically the Cambodian Ministry of Education, Youth and Sport. I'm just curious to hear more about, those initiatives and sort of what it's like partnering with the government. It sounds like are they funding the students to study at the university, or kind of how does that work? And I guess I'm always curious when an NGO starts working with the government, sometimes there's mismatch of vision. Do you ever run in any barriers or anything like that?
The answer is no. I don't think we run into any barrier with our government. I think it needs to be a mindset shift in the ways that we work together, right? And we have a fantastic, remarkable sort of experience working with our own government, especially the Ministry of Education. I think fundamentally, it's hard to move a nation forward when you don't trust your own government, and when you don't have empathy, a lack of understanding about the barriers, but also the how the government is handling something historically, but also current and the future, right? And so there's a lot of trust that I approach this work. Not the kind of trust that come from intimacy, not kind of trust that come from like credibility of the government and my credibility, but the kind of trust that recognize a shared history, the kind of trust that recognizes a shared future together, that's sort of like formulating become like the basis of the formula for us to work with government, right? And back to like being a locally led organization, that's key. For us, we recognize a lot of things that the government are doing well and the challenges that they face. And our work is to support our government to sort of advance those reforms that is much needed, right? And so and I'm just putting myself in my government shoes, right? In one hands, we are talking about a nation that come from a high trauma historically, right? There's a lot of legacy of instability, war, civil war, and those kind of things that we emerge out of that. Trying to take care of everybody, and education has been tremendously destroyed at the core of it. Family, as I said, as a fundamental unit of a system, also destroyed, because during genocide, if we connected and you educated, I will be killed too, you run away. Like, there's a lot of that sense of families and system and things that seem to be we need to rebuild together. And so on one hand, it's very difficult to attract excellent teachers into the system, right? On the other hand, we are combating the lack of teachers and schooling and things like that. And so the question is like, okay, so how do you sort of upgrading your existing teachers while attracting excellent ones? Like, so government always like facing that battles, right? And so it just, for us, is more like, there's a lot of challenges that our government and our community is facing, right? And so how can we be the missing, whatever we are the missing part of that? Like, can we be the resolution and the solution in some way? And not looking at system as a one part of this, like not looking at just one part of the system, but how can we looking at the system as involving so many actors and know our place in that system, you know? I think that's how we approach. I think it starts with your attitude and your mindset and how you approach partnership, you know? I think that go a long way in this work.
You know, it's funny, I just interviewed a guest who maybe had a similar mindset. He actually went from an academic and then went to the government, and he said, "Oh wow, this is a lot harder than I expected when I was, just an academic critiquing the government." So that's kind of funny to see that, you know, even across the world. This was in Uzbekistan. So
yeah,
you know, we're kind of coming to the end of our podcast. And one of the things that I always kind of like to ask my guests to end on, you know, if they sort of have like something to offer our audience, you know, a final message, a final thought. And from your standpoint, you know, especially why it's crucial to listen to sort of local voices, but then also, you know, maybe some words of wisdom for people who might be listening and thinking about starting their own organization.
So for the audience, the short answer is we all need your support, right? Resources to sort of continue the momentum that we build here locally. The longer sort of wisdom or ask is for the audience to consider looking at this whole education work as a long game. You never feels like they're gonna be like a big win 10 years from now. And if you're looking at this work as a long game, as intergenerational, you might operate very differently, right? And then you look at failure as completely different. Every failure is a gift for you to learn. You're looking at resilience as not individual, but as a collective, as shared. It's coming back up together. So the question might, if we work together in a long game, then you will see some sort of short-term bumps along the way, and you might not like give up easily, right? Because you approach it from a long game perspective. And so every single minute and every single day is an opportunity for you to sort of make progress. You know, it's keep an eye on the prize and long game, and don't lose the battles too quick. Save your energy, reserve, set good intention, everything you do. And it's okay that you don't have to have everything figured out. To start something from nothing is really embracing the growth mindset that 1, can I learn? 2, what do I need to learn? And 3, who help me learn? And I think that learning and that journey will take us a long way together.
Wonderful. Well, we'll end on that message. And we do appreciate, Moni, having you on the podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Thanks for listening.